You can't be serious. Lady, this ain't a charity service. Find your own way." He said it through a 2-inch gap in the window, the rain hammering the roof of the cab, and then he pulled away from the curb without another word. The tires threw a thin sheet of water across the sidewalk as he went. Dr. Celeste Okafor stood there on the corner of Meridian and Fifth, her hospital badge clipped to the lapel of her coat, her leather satchel pulled tight against her side, the rain soaking through her shoulders in the time it took her to register what had just happened. She had her hand still raised. She lowered it slowly. A man in a gray overcoat watched from the shelter of a building awning 20 feet away. He looked at her, then at the retreating cab, then back at his phone. He did not move. 2 women sharing an umbrella near the crosswalk had seen the whole thing. They turned away. The cab's yellow roof light, still lit, still marking it as available, shrank into the rain and disappeared around the corner on Garfield. What that driver did not know, what none of them standing there in the rain knew, was who he had just passed. He did not know her name. He did not know her title. He did not know that in 3 hours the distance between that curb and a trauma bay at Mercy General would collapse into something he would never fully explain away. Stay with this one to the end. Every detail is here for a reason. But before we get to that room, let me take you back to the beginning. Let me show you who Celeste Okafor really was, and how she came to be standing in the rain on a Tuesday evening in November with water running down the back of her collar and her hands perfectly still. Now, here is what most people did not know about Celeste Okafor. She had grown up on the south side of Columbus, Ohio, in a 2-bedroom house on Delmar Street that smelled of her mother's cooking and the particular damp of old radiators working hard against a Midwestern winter. Her mother, Adaeze Okafor, had come to Columbus from Enugu, Nigeria in 1981 with a nursing certificate, $40, and a name that most of her co-workers mispronounced for the first 3 years without apology. Adaeze had worked night shifts at Grant Medical Center for 22 years. She had raised Celeste and her younger brother Emeka largely alone, in that house on Delmar, with a discipline that was not harsh but was absolute. Adaeze had a saying she repeated so often that Celeste could hear it in her sleep even now. 30 years later, standing in the rain in a city where she held more credentials than most people in any room she entered. "You do not announce the tree," her mother used to say, pressing the words into Celeste's shoulder with one hand while stirring something on the stove with the other. "You let them sit in the shade, then they know." Celeste had taken that instruction and built her entire life inside it. She had not gone to medical school because it was expected. She had gone because she had watched her mother work herself down to a bone-deep tiredness caring for other people's bodies, and Celeste had decided at 11 that she would understand those bodies from the inside out, at a level where no one could question her competence or dismiss her worth. She graduated from Ohio State with a 3.97 GPA in biochemistry. She went to Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and finished second in her class. She completed her residency in emergency medicine at Massachusetts General, then a fellowship in trauma surgery at the University of Chicago, and then she did something that surprised nearly everyone who knew her trajectory. She came home. Not to Columbus exactly, but to the Midwest. To Mercy General Hospital in Crestfield, a mid-sized city in central Ohio where the emergency department was underfunded. The patient load was brutal, and the staff turnover was high. She had turned down positions at 3 larger institutions. She had turned down a department chair offer in Atlanta. She came to Mercy General because the department needed someone who could do the work, and because her mother had taught her that the tree does not choose the most visible hill. She had been at Mercy General for 9 years. She was now the attending physician in the trauma unit. She had published 14 peer-reviewed papers, trained 31 residents, and been asked to consult at hospitals in 4 different states on 3 separate occasions. She did not have a publicist. She did not have a social media presence. She drove a 12-year-old Volvo and kept it in the parking structure on the 2nd level, space 44, the same space for 9 years. She did not announce the tree. On the evening of November 14th, Celeste had stayed late to finish a consultation on a post-operative case, something not strictly her responsibility but that a colleague had asked her to review. She finished at 6:30. The parking structure elevator was out of service for the 3rd time that month, and she decided to walk to the transit station rather than climb 6 flights in a stairwell that smelled of exhaust and standing water. She stepped outside into rain she had not anticipated, having left her umbrella in the car. She stood on the corner of Meridian and 5th for 11 minutes, watching 3 cabs pass without slowing. The 4th slowed. The driver looked at her through the glass. He looked at her badge, her coat, her face, and then he said what he said, and he drove away. His name was Gary Pruitt. He had been driving for Crestfield Metro Cab for 6 years. He was 49 years old. He had, by his own later accounting, a policy he did not articulate as a policy but which shaped his decisions in ways he had never examined carefully. He preferred certain fares, certain neighborhoods, certain kinds of passengers. He had driven past 3 black women that evening before Celeste. He had stopped for a white couple 2 blocks north and taken them east. He had been heading back downtown when he saw her. He slowed. He looked. He made his calculation in approximately 4 seconds. He said 9 words. Then he drove away. What Gary Pruitt did not know, pulling back into traffic on Meridian Street with the rain on his windshield, was that the woman he had left on that corner had treated over 4,000 patients in the Mercy General Emergency Department over 9 years. He did not know her particular expertise in thoracic trauma and acute cardiac events. He did not know her name. He did not know that his own name was on file at Mercy General because he had been a patient there twice, once in 2019 for a kidney stone, once in 2021 for a laceration on his left forearm. He did not know any of this. He knew only that he had made a choice, and the choice had felt, in the moment, like no choice at all. Celeste watched the cab go. She did not curse after it. She did not pull out her phone to report it, not then. She stood in the rain for a moment with her satchel against her side and her mother's voice somewhere behind her sternum, quiet and certain. "You do not announce the tree." Then she walked to the transit station, took the 6:47 southbound train, and was home by 7:15. She made tea. She ate the rice and stew she had made on Sunday. She graded 2 resident case reports. She went to bed at 10. She did not think about Gary Pruitt again that night. He, however, was about to think about her for the rest of his life. Now, let me tell you about the place where everything converged. Mercy General's emergency department occupied the entire east wing of the 1st floor, a long, fluorescent-lit corridor that smelled of antiseptic and the particular exhaustion of strangers, and Celeste had learned to read that smell the way a sailor reads weather. She had walked through those double doors on the morning of November 15th at 7:45, 16 hours after Gary Pruitt had left her on the corner of Meridian and 5th. The department was already busy. There was a chest pain in Bay 2, a pediatric asthma case in Bay 5, a woman in her 70s with a possible hip fracture awaiting imaging in the hallway. Celeste moved through all of it with the efficiency of someone who had learned to triage not just patients but the entire environment of a room. She had a resident, Dr. Marcus Webb, a second year, who was talented and knew it slightly too much and slightly too soon. She had a charge nurse named Dolores Tatum, who had been at Mercy General for 23 years and who knew the department the way Adeze Okafor had known her kitchen, completely and without sentimentality. Dolores was the one who had seen the cab pass Celeste the night before. She had been sitting at the bus stop across the street, waiting for the 6:50, and she had watched the whole thing. She had watched the cab slow, watched the driver look, watched him speak and pull away. She had seen Celeste stand in the rain with her hand still raised and then lower it, and she had felt something tighten in her chest that she recognized and did not enjoy recognizing. She had thought about calling out across the street. She had not. She had told herself there was nothing to do, which was true in the immediate and not true in the larger sense, and she had carried that small failure with her onto the bus and home and into the next morning. When Celeste walked in at 7:45, Dolores handed her the overnight summary without ceremony, the way she always did. But Dolores watched her a moment longer than usual. Celeste did not notice, or if she did, she gave no sign. The morning moved the way mornings in the department moved, fast and without pause. By 9 o'clock, Celeste had seen 7 patients. By 10, she had performed 1 procedure, reviewed 3 imaging sets, and corrected a medication order that would have caused a dangerous interaction in a 60-year-old man with a compromised liver. She did it without drama. She corrected the order, explained the reasoning to the resident who had written it, and moved on. Quietly, completely, without announcement. At 9:47, the radio call came in. Paramedics were 3 minutes out with a 49-year-old male, unrestrained driver in a single-vehicle collision on the Garfield overpass. The cab had hit the median barrier at approximately 40 miles per hour. The patient was conscious but deteriorating. Suspected internal bleeding. BP dropping. The paramedics had a name on the dispatch sheet. Gary Pruitt. Dolores heard the name first. She was standing at the central station when the call came through, and she looked up and across the corridor to where Celeste was writing in a patient chart, and something moved across Dolores's face that was not quite a word and not quite a question. She did not say anything. She pulled the incoming trauma bay and began preparing it, because that was her job, and because whatever she was feeling in that moment, her job was not a place for it. Celeste heard the name on the radio and did not react. Not visibly. Her pen did not pause on the chart. Her shoulders did not move. She finished the sentence she was writing, capped the pen, and walked to the trauma bay. She did not know yet that it was the same man. Pruitt was not an uncommon name. 49-year-old male cab driver was a description, not a face. She had not memorized the features behind the glass on Meridian Street. She had simply been passed in the rain, and she had gone home. And now there was a patient incoming, and she had a bay to prepare and a team to position. That was all she was thinking about. The paramedics came through the doors at 9:51. The patient was on a gurney, an oxygen mask over his face, 1 IV line already running. He was pale in the particular way that internal bleeding makes a person pale, a grayish interior pallor that Celeste recognized immediately. His BP on the paramedic sheet was 88/60 and dropping. His abdomen was rigid. She called the assessment in under 30 seconds. Suspected splenic laceration, possible hepatic involvement, imaging, and a surgical consult immediately. She was already moving, already directing, already inside the work the way she had been inside it for 9 years. It was Marcus Webb, standing at the foot of the gurney, who made the connection. He had been at a bus stop half a block north that evening, and he had seen the cab pass Celeste and recognized her coat and her badge, and felt a flash of something he had not known what to do with, and he had done nothing, which he had not been proud of. Now he was looking at the patient on the gurney and the name on the intake sheet, and something was assembling itself in his mind with the slow, terrible clarity of a thing you cannot unknow once you know it. He said nothing. He did what Celeste had trained him to do. He moved. And it was about to get much more complicated than any of them had anticipated. The trauma bay smelled of latex and cold saline, and the metallic sharpness of blood collecting where it had no business collecting, and Celeste moved through that smell the way she had moved through it 10,000 times before, without flinching, without hesitation, without anything except the work. Gary Pruitt lay on the gurney with his eyes half open and his skin the color of old wax. His breathing was shallow and rapid, the kind that tells you the body is trying to compensate for something it cannot compensate for much longer. His abdomen was distended on the left side. His systolic was 84 and fallen. Celeste stood at his left, her gloved hands moving across his abdomen in the practiced, deliberate sequence of a palpation she had performed so many times that her hands knew what they were looking for before her mind had fully named it. Splenic laceration, grade 3, possibly 4. She called for a fast ultrasound, 2 large-bore IVs, a type and cross-match, a massive transfusion protocol on standby, and the surgical attending on call, Dr. Raymond Cho, who was 3 floors up in the OR finishing a procedure. She did all of this in 40 seconds. Marcus Webb was on the other side of the gurney, following her calls, moving with the efficiency she had spent 2 years instilling in him. He did not look at her face. He looked at the patient, the monitor, the ultrasound probe she was positioning over the left upper quadrant. There was something in the set of his jaw, something tight and deliberate that Dolores Tatum, standing at the supply cart near the door, recognized as the face of a person caring more than the moment required. The ultrasound image came up on the screen. Free fluid in the peritoneum. Significant. Celeste looked at it for 3 seconds, then looked away. She had already known. The image was confirmation, not revelation. "Or needs to know we're coming," she said. "Get Cho on the phone now." She never raised her voice in the bay. Dolores had worked with physicians who shouted in trauma, who used volume as a substitute for clarity. Celeste had never been one of them. Her voice was the same in the trauma bay as in the hallway, level, precise, carrying enough weight that no one ever needed to ask her to repeat herself. Gary Pruitt's eyes moved. He was looking at the ceiling, then at the lights, then at the face above him, and something in his expression shifted in the way expressions shift when the body is frightened and the mind is beginning to understand why. "Am I going to be okay?" he said. It was not quite a question. It was the thing people say when they need to say something and don't have the language for what they actually need. Celeste looked at his face directly, with the full attention of someone who understood that the face was data too, that the eyes and the skin and the set of the mouth told her things the monitors could not. "We're taking care of you," she said. "Stay with me." 4 words. delivered without ceremony. She had already moved back to the monitor. She did not recognize him yet. The face on the gurney was the face of a patient in distress, gray and frightened and stripped of whatever it had been in ordinary life. She had not memorized the features behind the glass on Meridian Street. She had gone home and made tea, and graded 2 case reports and gone to bed, because that was what the work required of her, that she not carry the weight of every small cruelty into the next day. So she did not know, not yet. It was Dolores who knew. Dolores had seen his face through the rain the night before, not clearly, but clearly enough. She was standing 4 feet from the gurney, looking at the name on the intake sheet and the man on the gurney, and she was doing the thing she had trained herself to do in 23 years of emergency nursing, keeping her face still, her hands moving, her mouth closed about everything that was not the patient. She handed Celeste the blood pressure cuff. Their hands touched for a moment. Dolores did not speak. Celeste did not look up, but Dolores had already made a decision. She had made it in the 3 seconds it took to understand what she was looking at. She had failed once at the bus stop, standing in the rain with the 650 pulling up and her feet not moving toward the curb. She was not going to fail again. She would do her job completely. She would give this patient everything the department had. And when the time came, she would do the other thing too, the thing that was also her job, the thing she had been carrying since the night before like a stone in her coat pocket. She would make sure the record was complete. Raymond Cho came through the bay doors at 10:08, still in his surgical cap. He looked at the ultrasound image, the BP reading, then at Celeste. "Grade 4?" he said. "Possibly," she said. "The free fluid is significant. He's not going to stabilize on fluids alone." Cho nodded once. He had worked with Celeste for 6 years and had learned that when she said possibly, she meant probably, and when she said probably, she meant certainly, and when she said certainly, you had better already be moving. He was already moving. "Or 2 is open," he said. "Let's go." They moved Gary Pruitt out of the trauma bay at 10:12. Celeste walked with the gurney to the elevator and gave Cho the verbal handoff in the hallway, precise and complete, every detail in the order a surgeon needed it. She had done this handoff so many times it had its own rhythm, and she delivered it now the way her mother had once delivered a plate of food, with care and without performance. She watched the elevator doors close. She stood in the hallway for a moment. Then she went back to the department, because there were 6 other patients waiting and the morning had not stopped for any of this. It was Marcus Webb who finally said it. He found her at the nursing station at 10:23, writing in a chart, and stood beside her without speaking, which was not his habit. Marcus Webb was not a person who stood quietly beside things. His standing quietly was itself a kind of statement. Celeste looked up. "That was the cab driver," Marcus said, low enough that it stayed between them. "From last night, on Meridian. I was at the stop on the north side. I saw him pass you." Celeste looked at his face, at the tightness in his jaw, at the thing behind his eyes that was part guilt and part something he was still working out. Then she looked back at the chart. "I know," she said. She had known for approximately 4 minutes. The name on the intake sheet had connected to the name she had not consciously retained, but which had apparently lodged somewhere below the level of decision, and the age, 49, and the cab, and the Garfield overpass, 3 blocks from Meridian Street. It had come together quietly, the way things came together when you were not forcing them, and she had felt something move through her chest that was not anger, and was not satisfaction, and was not grief exactly, but was something in the space between all three. She had kept riding. "You didn't hesitate," Marcus said. It was not quite a question. "No," she said, "I didn't." She capped the pen. She looked at him again, long enough that he understood she was about to say something she meant him to carry. "That is what we do," she said. "That is the whole of it. You understand?" Marcus Webb was 28 years old and talented and knew it slightly too much. But in that moment, standing at the nursing station, with the fluorescent light overhead and the weight of what she had just said settling into him, he looked younger than that. He looked like someone who had just been handed something they would spend a long time learning to hold properly. He nodded. He did not speak. Celeste picked up the next chart. "Now, here's what happened in the hours that followed and why it matters." Raymond Cho performed the surgery on Gary Pruitt at 10:40. The splenic laceration was a grade 4, as Celeste had suspected, and there was a small hepatic contusion that had not yet begun to bleed but would have, given another hour. Cho repaired the laceration and managed the contusion with the efficiency of a surgeon working from a precise and complete handoff. The surgery took 2 hours and 17 minutes. Gary Pruitt came out of the OR at 1:07 in the afternoon. Stable, his pressure restored, his color beginning to return from wax to something closer to the color of a living man. He was moved to the surgical recovery unit on the 3rd floor. He would remain there for 4 days. On the 2nd day, a woman from the hospital's patient relations office came to see him. Her name was Sandra Reyes, and she was a careful, methodical person who had worked in patient relations for 11 years and who had learned to carry difficult conversations the way a good nurse carries a full tray, steadily, without spilling. She sat down beside Gary Pruitt's bed and told him, in plain and careful language, what had happened. She told him the name of the physician who had assessed him in the trauma bay, identified the grade of his injury, called for the surgical consult that had almost certainly saved his life, and delivered the handoff to Dr. Cho. She told him the name was Dr. Celeste Okafor. Gary Pruitt lay in the bed with the IV line in his arm and the surgical dressing on his abdomen, and the particular stillness of a man who has been handed something he does not know how to put down. Sandra Reyes watched his face. She had delivered difficult information before, news of death, of diagnosis, of error. She had learned to read the face of a person receiving something they had not prepared for. What she saw was not defiance, it was not dismissal. It was something quieter and more complicated. Something that moved across his features like weather moving across a flat field, visible and slow and impossible to stop once it had started. He did not speak for a long time. The monitor beside him beeped at its steady interval. Finally, he said, "She knew. When she was working on me, she knew who I was." Sandra Reyes said, "Yes, she did." Another silence. "And she didn't," he started, and then he stopped and started again. "She didn't stop." "No," Sandra Reyes said, "she did not." Gary Pruitt turned his face toward the window. The sky outside was the flat gray of a November afternoon in central Ohio, the kind of sky that gives nothing back. He looked at it for a long time. Sandra Reyes left the folder on the bedside table. It contained, among other things, a formal complaint filed with Crestfield Metro Cab by the hospital's patient advocacy office on behalf of a staff physician, citing a documented pattern of discriminatory service refusal. It contained the date. It contained the corner of Meridian and 5th. It contained the time, 6:31 in the evening on November 14th. It contained 9 words transcribed from the incident report Dolores Tatum had filed at 7:05 that morning, before Celeste had arrived, before the radio call had come in, before any of it. Dolores had written down what she saw. She had written down the cab number, the direction of travel, the words she had heard through the rain from across the street. She had written it down because she had been at that bus stop and had not moved, and the writing was the thing she could still do. The record was the thing she could still make complete. She had filed it quietly, without announcement, before her shift had fully begun. The tree does not announce itself. But the shade is real, and it falls where it falls, and eventually everyone standing in the sun long enough begins to understand the difference. The formal complaint landed on the desk of Crestfield Metro Cab's operations director, a man named Paul Whitfield, on the morning of November 16th. It arrived by certified mail and by email simultaneously, which was the hospital's legal department's way of ensuring no one could later claim they had not received it. Whitfield was 53 years old and had run the operations side of Crestfield Metro Cab for 8 years, and he understood that a complaint from a hospital's legal department was not a document to be filed and forgotten. It had dates and times, and a cab number, and a name, and 9 words transcribed from a witness statement, and it had the name of the physician who had been refused service, and it had, attached as a secondary document, a brief summary of that physician's professional profile, included not as a flourish but as evidence of the harm the refusal had caused. Whitfield read the complaint twice. Then he called the company's attorney. Then he called Gary Pruitt's supervisor and asked him to pull the GPS logs and the dash camera footage from Pruitt's cab for the evening of November 14th. The footage confirmed everything. It showed the cab slowing on Meridian Street at 6:31. It showed the window coming down. It showed a woman in a coat with a hospital badge on her lapel standing at the curb with her hand raised. It showed the window going up. It showed the cab pulling away, its available light still lit, and it showed, 2 blocks north, the cab stopping for 2 passengers who were not black and taking them east. Whitfield watched the footage once. He did not watch it a second time. He called his attorney back and said 4 words. "How bad is this?" The attorney said, "Very." Gary Pruitt was placed on administrative suspension on November 17th, while the company conducted its internal review. The review took 6 days. On November 23rd, the day before Thanksgiving, Crestfield Metro Cab terminated Gary Pruitt's contract for violation of the company's non-discrimination policy, a policy that existed in the employee handbook he had signed when he was hired, and that he had, by his own later admission, never read with any care. He was not the first driver to be terminated for this kind of violation. He was, however, the first one whose termination was accompanied by a referral to the Ohio Civil Rights Commission, which Whitfield's attorney had recommended as a preemptive measure, a way of demonstrating that the company was taking the matter seriously before the commission came to them. The referral was filed on the same day as the termination. The Ohio Civil Rights Commission opened a formal investigation on December 2nd. That investigation expanded beyond Gary Pruitt. The GPS logs and dash camera footage covered a 60-day window of his driving history, and what the investigators found was a pattern. 17 documented instances of available cabs passing black passengers without stopping. 11 instances of cabs stopping for white passengers within 2 blocks of a black passenger who had been passed. The data was not ambiguous. It was not a matter of interpretation. It was a record, and the record was complete, and the record said what it said. Crestfield Metro Cab settled the civil rights investigation in March of the following year. The settlement required mandatory anti-discrimination training for all drivers, passenger-facing cameras in all vehicles, an independent complaint review process, and a civil penalty of $240,000, a portion of which was directed to a fund providing transportation assistance to underserved communities in Crestfield. The settlement was not Gary Pruitt's doing. It was the doing of a record made complete by a woman who had been sitting at a bus stop in the rain, who had carried a stone in her coat pocket through the night and into the next morning, and who had written down what she saw before her shift had fully begun. Dolores Tatum was nominated for the hospital's annual Staff Recognition Award in January. She was nominated by Dr. Raymond Cho, who had been told the full story by Sandra Reyes, who had been told it by Marcus Webb, who had finally found the words for what he had been carrying. Cho wrote the nomination in his own hand, on paper, which was not how nominations were typically submitted, but which was how he chose to do it because he felt the occasion warranted something that could not be undone by a deleted email. He wrote that Dolores Tatum had demonstrated, in a moment of institutional failure, the particular courage of a person who chooses to make the record complete when no one is requiring them to do so. He wrote that this was the kind of courage that did not announce itself and did not seek recognition, and was therefore exactly the kind of courage that deserved it. Dolores received the award at the hospital's spring staff recognition dinner. She stood at the podium for a moment without speaking, which was unlike her, and then she said simply that she had only done what she could still do, and that she wished she had done more sooner. She sat back down. The room was quiet for a moment, in the way that rooms go quiet when something true has been said plainly. Celeste was in the audience. She did not stand and speak. She had already said what she needed to say to Dolores privately, in the hallway outside the department. On the morning, she had read the incident report and understood what it contained. She had found Dolores at the nursing station and put her hand briefly on Dolores's arm and said, "Thank you." 2 words, delivered without ceremony. Dolores had nodded and looked away, because some things are too large to be held comfortably in direct eye contact, and both of them knew it. Marcus Webb requested a transfer to the trauma unit as his primary rotation for the remainder of his residency. The request was approved. He finished his 2nd year with an evaluation that noted his composure under pressure and his capacity to hold the complexity of a situation without allowing it to distort his clinical judgment. Celeste wrote 2 sentences of that evaluation herself, at the request of the program director without embellishment, because the facts were sufficient and the facts were good. Gary Pruitt was discharged from Mercy General on November 19th. He left through the main entrance on a gray Tuesday morning with a discharge packet in his hand and a surgical dressing under his shirt, and the name of a physician written on a card that Sandra Reyes had placed in the folder on his bedside table. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the cold air, looking at nothing in particular, and then he walked to the parking lot where his wife had come to collect him. He did not contact Celeste. She did not expect him to. She had not treated him in order to receive anything from him, and she did not require his acknowledgement in order for the work to have been worth doing. The work was worth doing because the work was worth doing. That was the whole of it. That was what she had told Marcus Webb at the nursing station, and it was what she believed, and it was what her mother had taught her in that two-bedroom house on Delmar Street, with the radiators working hard against the cold and the smell of something on the stove and a hand pressed to a shoulder, and words that did not ask to be remembered, but were. In the spring, Celeste drove back to Columbus on a Saturday. She drove the 12-year-old Volvo south on Route 23 with the windows down a little, the way she did when the weather was turning and the air still had the last edge of winter but was beginning to soften. She drove to Delmar Street. She parked in front of the house which her mother still lived in, which still had the same front porch with the same 2 chairs and the same ceramic pot by the door that Adaise had brought from Nigeria in a checked bag in 1981, and that had survived every Ohio winter since. Adaise was on the porch when Celeste pulled up. She was 81 years old and moved more slowly than she once had, but she was on the porch, which was where she preferred to be when the weather allowed, because she liked to watch the street and the neighbors and the light moving through the trees. She watched Celeste get out of the car and walk up the front path, and she said nothing until Celeste had come up the steps and sat in the other chair. Then Adaise said, "You look tired." "I'm fine," Celeste said. "I know you're fine," her mother said. "I said you look tired." Celeste smiled. It was a small smile, contained, the kind she kept for her mother, and for moments that did not require her to perform anything. They sat on the porch together in the spring light, the street quiet around them, the trees on Delmar beginning to open, and Celeste told her mother the story. Not all of it, the parts that mattered, the rain and the corner and the cab and the 9 words, the gurney, the ultrasound image, the grade 4 laceration and the handoff and the surgery and the folder on the bedside table. Adaise listened without interrupting, which was how she always listened, completely and without filling the spaces. When Celeste finished, her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You did not announce the tree." "No," Celeste said, and they sat in the shade. "Yes," Adaise nodded slowly, looking at the street. The light was coming through the elm at the edge of the yard in long, pale bars, the way it comes in early spring when the leaves are not yet full. She reached over and put her hand on Celeste's arm, pressing the words in before she said them, the way she always had. "Then they know," she said. They sat there for a long time after that, the 2 of them, in the shade of a tree that had never once needed to announce itself. Now, I want to say something directly, because this story deserves it. What happened on the corner of Meridian and 5th on a Tuesday evening in November was not exceptional. That is the hardest part of it. It was not a rare event or an isolated incident or an aberration in an otherwise fair system. It was ordinary. It happens in cities across this country every day, in cabs and ride shares and waiting rooms and boardrooms and hallways. A small, certain calculation that some people make about other people in 4 seconds or less. The decision that a person's worth can be read from their face and their coat and the corner they are standing on. It happens to doctors and lawyers and teachers and engineers and mothers waiting in the rain with their hands raised. It happens to people whose names we will never know, whose stories will never be told, whose incident reports will never be filed. What was not ordinary was Dolores Tatum, sitting at a bus stop in the rain and carrying a stone in her coat pocket through the night and writing down what she saw before her shift had fully begun. What was not ordinary was a woman who had been passed in the rain going home and making tea and grading case reports and returning the next morning to do the work completely, without hesitation, without announcement, without requiring the world to understand what she was before she gave it everything she had. Dignity does not wait to be recognized. It does not negotiate its terms. It does not withhold itself from the people who have failed to see it. It simply does the work, and the work is its own argument. And eventually, if the record is complete, the argument is heard. The question I keep returning to is this: how many people are standing on corners right now, in the rain, with their hands raised, whose names we do not know, and whose worth we have not taken the 4 seconds to consider? Drop a comment and tell me, because I genuinely want to hear it. Tell me about someone you know who carries something extraordinary that the world has not yet seen. Tell me what it costs to stay composed when the world has decided, in 4 seconds, that you're not worth stopping for. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to keep finding the people the world overlooked, the ones who built their worth in silence and whose names deserve to be said out loud, then subscribe, because that is what this channel does, every single week, without fail. The tree does not announce itself, but the shade is real.